There is an ancient paradox that has haunted every civilization. The very qualities that elevate a man or woman into leadership are the same qualities that condemn them to solitude. To be set apart is both a gift and a curse. We call it destiny, genius, charisma, or vision. But behind these noble words lies an invisible burden. The quiet knowledge that those who rise above the crowd are rarely embraced by it. From the dawn of philosophy, thinkers have wrestled with this paradox. Plato, in his allegory of the cave, described the philosopher who escapes the shadows and sees the sun. When he returns to his people with the light of truth, they do not thank him. They mock him, fear him, and even threaten to kill him. Leadership here is not elevation, it is exile. To see more clearly than others is to walk among them as a stranger. Nietzsche sharpened this insight with his vision of the Übermensch, the one who dares to create values beyond the herd. Yet, he warned, the herd instinct is cruel. Those who step outside its warm circle are branded as dangerous. The leader becomes a target, not a hero. To choose to live beyond the average is to accept a crown made of thorns. Carl Jung, in his studies of archetypes, reminds us that the leader often embodies the archetype of the hero, but the hero is never merely celebrated. He must descend into the underworld, face betrayal, and confront his shadow. In Jung's map of the psyche, the chosen one is not merely exalted but also crucified by the weight of projection. People do not see the leader as he is, they see in him their hopes, fears, and shadows. To be chosen is to become a mirror for the unconscious of the many. History itself confirms this haunting pattern. Socrates, who dared to question the comfortable illusions of Athens, was sentenced to death by the very democracy he sought to enlighten. Jesus of Nazareth, hailed by some as Messiah, was abandoned by his followers and crucified by the crowd that once cheered his entry into Jerusalem. Abraham Lincoln, the emancipator, walked through years of civil war knowing that his decisions would please no one fully. Even in myth, from Moses abandoned on the mountain to King Arthur betrayed by his knights, the story repeats itself. The leader is isolated, not because he is unloved, but because he is seen as something other than human. But why? Why does leadership isolate rather than elevate? Why does the crown always sit so heavily on the head of the one who wears it? Part of the answer lies in human psychology. Freud pointed out that every society requires repression, the pushing down of instinct and desire to maintain order. But someone must carry the unbearable contradictions of that repression. The leader, consciously or unconsciously, becomes the vessel of society's unresolved tensions. He is simultaneously worshipped and hated, trusted and distrusted, admired and resented. This ambivalence creates a strange loneliness. Another part lies in the darker side of human envy. As Schopenhauer noted, envy is among the most corrosive of emotions because it does not merely desire what the other has, it resents them for having it. To stand out is to invite resentment, whether one seeks it or not. The chosen one becomes a symbol of what others could not achieve, a reminder of their limitations, and so admiration quietly turns into bitterness. Yet there is also a deeper existential dimension. Sartre insisted that freedom is terrifying. To be confronted with someone who lives authentically, who dares to act decisively, bear responsibility, and chart their own path, is to be reminded of one's own freedom. And because most people flee from freedom into conformity, the presence of a leader is unsettling. The leader does not merely lead, he exposes, and people often punish those who expose them to truths they would rather not face. This is the curse of the chosen one. Leadership isolates, not because others are cruel by nature, but because the very structure of human existence makes it so. The one who sees more is destined to walk alone. The one who carries the collective must do so in silence, bearing projections, envy, and betrayal. But this is not simply tragedy, it is also initiation. Solitude can destroy the leader, yes, but it can also forge him. Marcus Aurelius, writing in his Meditations during the endless wars of the Roman frontier, reminded himself, "Be like the rocky headland, against which the waves keep crashing. It stands firm, and around it the seething waters are laid to rest." The solitude of the chosen one is not only curse, but crucible. In this series, we will journey into the depths of this paradox. We will explore why true leadership isolates rather than elevates, drawing on philosophy, psychology, history, and myth. We will see how envy, projection, and the shadow conspire to make the leader a stranger among his own people. And finally, we will ask, how can the chosen one endure this solitude without collapsing into despair? Because in the end, the real question is not whether leaders are destined to be alone. That much history is already answered. The real question is, what will they become in their solitude? Broken or transformed? To understand why leaders are destined to be alone, we must first understand a strange law of human psychology. People rarely see others as they are. Instead, they see in them a reflection of themselves. This process, which Carl Jung called projection, lies at the heart of why leadership is not elevation, but exile. Jung observed that the human psyche contains both light and shadow, those qualities we acknowledge and those we repress. The shadow does not vanish when ignored, it seeks expression, and one of the easiest places it finds expression is in other people. We project onto others the traits we cannot accept in ourselves. Both our unacknowledged darkness and our buried greatness, leaders, by virtue of their visibility and symbolic position, become the prime screens for these projections. Think of the king or queen seated on the throne. They are not simply individuals, they are vessels. The crowd looks up and sees in them their own secret ambitions, their own suppressed rage, their own half-forgotten hopes. This is why the same leader can be adored by some and despised by others, often for the very same qualities. What is really being loved or hated is not the leader himself, but the reflection of the masses' inner world. Freud, though critical of Jung, offered a similar insight in his study of group psychology. He argued that the leader becomes an ego ideal, a figure onto whom individuals displace both authority and desire. The leader functions as a substitute father, a symbolic anchor for the group's collective neuroses. But this position is inherently unstable because just as children grow ambivalent toward their fathers, both dependent on and resentful of them, so too do societies turn on their leaders. The leader is loved as long as he reassures, hated as soon as he exposes. History is filled with examples of this cruel cycle of projection. Consider Julius Caesar. To his soldiers he embodied their courage and ambition. To his rivals in the Senate he embodied tyranny and arrogance. The man himself was perhaps neither purely one nor the other, but projection magnified his figure until he was no longer seen as Caesar the man, but Caesar the symbol. And once he became symbol, he also became scapegoat. Daggers rained down not on flesh alone, but on the mirror in which Rome saw both its glory and its corruption. Or think of Nelson Mandela. To millions, he was the saint who embodied forgiveness, but to others, he was the revolutionary who would not abandon his principles. Was he either or both? Mandela himself admitted that the world did not see him, but a myth. "I am not a saint," he once said, "unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." The isolation of such a man is not physical imprisonment alone. It is the prison of being seen as something other than oneself. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster." Yet the deeper danger is that others will paint you as the monster, whether you are or not. Once a leader becomes the canvas of projection, he loses ownership of his own identity. His name becomes a battlefield of meanings he never chose. This is why true leaders feel a peculiar loneliness even in the midst of adoration. Surrounded by thousands, they realize that few, if any, actually see them. The applause is not for their being, but for the fantasy imposed upon them. And worse still, the hatred is not for their actions alone, but for the shadow they unwittingly carry on behalf of the crowd. Sartre, with his relentless gaze into human freedom, explained this through the concept of the look. To be looked at is to be reduced, pinned into an image that may have little to do with one's true self. The leader, constantly under the look, is imprisoned in others' definitions. He is no longer free to simply be. He must endlessly wrestle with the images projected onto him. Consider the biblical figure of Moses. To his people, he was both savior and betrayer. When he led them through the Red Sea, he was adored. When they hungered in the desert, he was cursed. His loneliness was not only that of physical burden, but of perpetual misrecognition. He bore the people's faith and their rage, their devotion and their despair. And when he faltered, striking the rock in anger, he revealed the crushing paradox of leadership. To be chosen is to be chained, not by one's enemies, but by one's own followers. The danger of projection is not merely external. Over time, leaders may begin to internalize these projections. They start to believe the myth, whether saintly or monstrous, forgetting the fragile humanity beneath. This is why so many rulers collapse into tyranny or despair. They confuse the mask with the face. They forget that the image projected onto them is not their own reflection, but the shadow of the crowd. And so the leader is left with a bitter choice: to resist the projections and be misunderstood, or to accept them and lose oneself. Both paths lead to solitude, for even if one embraces the myth, one becomes estranged from one's own soul. This is the first great burden of the chosen one, not simply to lead, but to carry the unbearable weight of projections, to be seen not as one is, but as a mirror of the masses, to live in a hall of distorted reflections, never sure if anyone truly knows the face behind the mask. If projection makes the leader into a mirror, then envy is the venom that poisons the reflection. For as long as humans have walked together in tribes, they have carried within them a paradoxical impulse: to admire those who rise above, and to resent them for the very same reason. Leadership becomes unbearable not simply because people fail to understand their leaders, but because they envy them. And envy, unlike jealousy, does not merely wish to possess, it wishes to destroy. Arthur Schopenhauer, ever the bleak diagnostician of the human condition, described envy as the most foolish of emotions, because it gains nothing for the one who feels it, yet consumes them nonetheless. Unlike desire, which can be satisfied, envy festers endlessly. If another shines too brightly, envy seeks not to share in the light, but to extinguish it. This is why leaders, no matter how generous or benevolent, find themselves targeted. Their very excellence becomes unbearable proof of what others have failed to achieve. Nietzsche saw envy as inseparable from the herd instinct. The herd resents the one who rises above because his existence threatens their sense of equality. To live beyond the average is to be judged as arrogant, even if no arrogance is shown. This is why Nietzsche's Übermensch is destined to walk alone. He is not hated for his cruelty, but for his greatness. His very flourishing is seen as an indictment of those who chose comfort over growth. Psychology confirms what philosophy intuited. In modern studies of status and group dynamics, envy appears whenever hierarchies form. Those at the top, even when their position is earned, are subjected to covert sabotage. Leaders find themselves surrounded not only by rivals who openly contest their position, but by supposed allies who secretly long for their downfall. The higher one rises, the more invisible daggers appear. History offers countless illustrations of envy's poison. Consider Alexander the Great. His generals followed him across deserts and mountains, yet their admiration soured into envy. At his death, they did not honor his vision of empire, but tore it apart, each carving a piece for themselves. His greatness did not unite them. It made his absence an opportunity to avenge years of envy. Or take Jesus of Nazareth, betrayed not by the Romans but by one of his own disciples. The Gospels suggest many motives for Judas, but envy lingers between the lines. How unbearable it must have been to follow a man who commanded not only loyalty but love. A love Judas could never fully claim for himself. Betrayal, in this sense, is envy's ultimate act. If I cannot possess the light, then let me extinguish it. Even in politics, the pattern persists. Abraham Lincoln, in his rise to the presidency, was called both tyrant and fool. His assassination was not simply the result of ideological opposition, but of the festering envy directed at a man who dared to embody moral courage in a time of cowardice. Those who take bold steps invite not only debate but resentment, and resentment, when deep enough, seeks blood. Jung might say that envy is born from unintegrated shadow. When people see a leader embody qualities they have denied in themselves, courage, discipline, clarity, vision, the sight is intolerable. Rather than admit their own weakness, they seek to pull down the one who dares to live differently. Thus the leader becomes a scapegoat, not for crimes committed, but for the unfulfilled longings of the crowd. Envy is especially dangerous because it hides behind virtue. Rarely does someone admit, "I envy him." Instead, they disguise envy in moral judgment. The leader is criticized not for greatness, but for supposed pride, not for achievement, but for imagined corruption. Envy dresses itself in the robes of justice, and so the leader faces attack not from obvious enemies, but from those who appear righteous. This creates an unbearable solitude. For the chosen one realizes that no act of kindness, no display of humility can fully dissolve envy. Even generosity can provoke it. To give is to remind others that one has something to give. To excel is to remind others that one has chosen mediocrity. In such a world, silence and solitude become the leader's only refuge. The Stoics understood this. Seneca, himself counselor to emperors, warned that one should never seek fame or recognition, for it is a poisoned gift. He who has much, Seneca wrote, will be envied by many. Marcus Aurelius, though emperor, confessed in his Meditations that the hatred of others must be endured like the cold or the wind, for to resent the resentment of others is to fall into their sickness. And yet, envy is not without its paradoxical gift, for it reveals to the leader the depth of his own strength. To be envied is to have stood apart, to have broken the invisible ceiling that binds most men. It is proof that one has dared to live greatly. The cost is solitude, but solitude can become a furnace in which character is tempered. The curse of envy, then, is not only that it isolates leaders from their people, but that it forces them to confront themselves. Deprived of the warmth of admiration, stripped of illusions of universal love, the chosen one must either collapse under the venom or grow immune to it. And in this immunity lies a kind of freedom. A freedom from needing the crowd at all. If projection makes the leader a mirror and envy makes him a target, then freedom makes him a stranger. For the essence of leadership is the willingness to choose when others prefer to drift. The leader is not simply the one who commands, he is the one who dares to bear responsibility. And responsibility, as Sartre reminds us, is the most terrifying weight of all. Jean-Paul Sartre declared that man is condemned to be free. Every choice, no matter how small, reveals that we are never merely determined by circumstances, but are always responsible for our response. Most people, however, flee this responsibility. They hide in roles, traditions, and collective opinions, soothing themselves with the illusion that I had no choice. This flight from freedom creates what Sartre called bad faith, the refusal to acknowledge one's own agency, but leaders cannot afford this escape. They are forced into the open. Every decision they make becomes visible, and every consequence is traced back to them. While others can blend into the anonymity of the herd, the leader must stand exposed, bearing the full weight of freedom. It is no wonder that true leadership isolates. It demands that one embrace the terrifying responsibility from which others recoil. Consider Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome. His writings are filled with the anguish of choice. He longed for the quiet of philosophy, yet bore the duty of ruling an empire. He could not claim the luxury of evasion. When plagues struck, when wars erupted, when conspiracies brewed, his decisions were inescapable. And so, even surrounded by advisors and soldiers, Marcus confesses in his Meditations the profound solitude of one who must always decide, and who must live with the knowledge that others will suffer for those decisions. Carl Jung offers another angle. For him, leadership often means embodying an archetype, the king, the hero, the sage. But archetypes are not comfortable garments, they are demanding spirits. To step into them is to shoulder a destiny larger than oneself. The leader cannot simply live for personal desire. He is claimed by a role that requires sacrifice. Freedom here does not feel like liberation, but like crucifixion. The individual dies into the responsibility of the archetype, and in that death lies a loneliness few can imagine. Even in myth, this theme of burden appears again and again. Hercules, tasked with his 12 labors, was not free in the way ordinary men were free. His strength condemned him to struggle. Prometheus, who stole fire for humanity, was chained to a rock in eternal punishment. In these myths, we glimpse a truth older than philosophy. The greater one's gifts, the heavier one's chains. Psychology sharpens this further. Viktor Frankl, in his study of meaning, argued that human beings ultimately crave responsibility, not pleasure. Pleasure alone leaves us empty. Responsibility gives us a sense of purpose. But here lies the paradox. While responsibility is what makes life meaningful, it is also what isolates those who take it seriously. Most prefer to scatter responsibility across the group, to dilute it until no one feels its sting. The leader, by contrast, concentrates responsibility into himself, and so his meaning deepens as his circle of companionship narrows. Modern life offers countless subtle examples of this burden. A parent who chooses integrity over convenience feels the isolation of leadership in the family. A teacher who refuses to lower standards to appease lazy students feels it in the classroom. A political dissenter who speaks truth against the state feels it in the prison cell. Freedom embraced is always a narrowing path. Fewer walk it, and fewer still remain beside you when the road grows steep. This explains why so many prefer the comfort of following. As Erich Fromm observed in Escape from Freedom, the terror of choosing one's own path drives people to submit to authority, ideology, or tradition. It feels safer to dissolve into the crowd than to stand in the clarity of freedom. But the chosen one, the true leader, has no such refuge. He is condemned to carry the choices of many, to live visibly in the freedom others avoid, and this makes him a foreigner even among his own people. Nietzsche saw this most clearly. For him, freedom was not comfort but danger. The higher we soar, he wrote, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly. To choose one's own values, to create one's own path, is to court misunderstanding and solitude. The leader's freedom is never shared equally. It is a mountain peak from which one can see far, but where the air is thin and company is scarce. Thus, the burden of freedom isolates in two ways. First, because leaders must take responsibility for choices that others avoid. leaving them estranged from the comfort of the crowd. And second, because the sight of someone living authentically in freedom unsettles those who hide from it. Just as light hurts the eyes of one who has dwelt too long in darkness, so the free man offends those still bound by bad faith. And yet, here too the curse of solitude hides a gift. For freedom embraced, though lonely, brings a clarity unknown to the conformist. The leader learns to endure the silence of responsibility. He learns to carry the unbearable without collapsing. And in that crucible, something remarkable is forged, a soul unbroken by the opinions of others. The curse of the chosen one, then, is not only the projections of the masses, nor only their envy, but the crushing responsibility of freedom. To be leader is to stand where others will not, to choose when others refuse, to bear what others deny. It is to carry the burden of freedom, a burden that isolates but also transforms. By now, the curse of the chosen one is clear. The leader is condemned to solitude by projection, poisoned by envy, and burdened by freedom. Yet if history and philosophy ended the story here, leadership would be nothing but tragedy. And yet, again and again, we find another pattern woven into the shadows. The solitude that isolates the chosen one is also the crucible that forges his strength. For solitude, though painful, is the one condition in which truth can be faced without disguise. Surrounded by adoration, one can believe the illusions projected onto oneself. Surrounded by envy, one can become consumed by resentment. But in solitude, stripped of applause and accusation alike, the leader confronts the raw question, "Who am I when no one is watching?" Marcus Aurelius, writing in his tent on the cold frontiers, poured his solitude into meditations that have endured for 2 millennia. In them we see a man stripped of courtly flattery and popular hatred alike, speaking only to his own soul. "You have power over your mind," he wrote, "not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." His philosophy was not written for us, it was written for himself to survive the crushing isolation of command. But in surviving, he left behind wisdom that still steadies us. Carl Jung would argue that this confrontation in solitude is the encounter with the self, the archetypal wholeness that lies beyond ego. Leaders who endure solitude without breaking discover depths of the psyche that followers rarely glimpse. They integrate shadow and light, becoming not saints nor monsters, but complete. It is this integration that allows them to lead with authenticity rather than performance. Their solitude becomes not a prison, but an initiation into their deeper being. Consider Abraham Lincoln, often found walking alone at night through the White House gardens, wrestling with decisions that would split a nation. His solitude nearly crushed him. He suffered depression, despair, and alienation, and yet in this crucible he discovered the resilience to preserve the Union. He once said, "I have been driven many times upon my knees by the overwhelming conviction that I had nowhere else to go." Isolation became the furnace in which humility and resolve were fused. Even myths echo this truth. The hero must always enter the wilderness, the cave, or the desert. Moses ascended Sinai alone. Jesus withdrew into the desert for 40 days. The Buddha sat beneath the Bodhi tree in silence. In each case, solitude was not incidental but essential. Without solitude there is no transformation. The chosen one returns to the people not because solitude is avoided, but because it is endured. Yet solitude remains double-edged. Many leaders collapse beneath it, succumbing to paranoia or despair. Nietzsche himself, prophet of the Übermensch, descended into madness, perhaps unable to carry the very solitude he exalted. Stalin, consumed by suspicion, turned solitude into cruelty. In both cases, the isolation of leadership destroyed rather than forged. This reminds us that solitude is not automatically a gift. It must be confronted with courage, humility, and discipline. The psychological danger is clear. Isolation amplifies the inner voices we have not reconciled. If one's shadow remains unintegrated, solitude becomes torment. But if one has done the work of inner confrontation, solitude becomes a teacher. The chosen one must not only endure loneliness but use it as a mirror to face what he most fears. Only then does isolation transform from curse into crucible. This is why self-mastery is the final key. Leaders who learn to master themselves, to discipline thought, regulate emotion, and cultivate inner stillness, find in solitude a wellspring of strength. Seneca advised, "He who is brave is free." But bravery here does not mean bold speeches or outward defiance. It means the quiet courage to sit with one's own soul without flinching. The leader who achieves this no longer depends on the fickle love or hatred of the crowd. He stands firm like the rocky headland Marcus described, unshaken by the crashing waves. And what of those who are not leaders in the political or historic sense? The lesson still applies. Each of us in moments of life becomes the chosen one. Each of us faces times when responsibility cannot be evaded, when envy and projection surround us, when freedom demands that we choose. In those moments, we too must step into solitude, not as punishment, but as initiation. So what, then, is the true fate of the chosen one? Is he destined merely to be alone? Perhaps. But solitude is not the final word. The final word is transformation. The leader who endures solitude without collapsing, who wrestles with himself without disintegrating, emerges with a strength no applause can give and no envy can take away. His leadership no longer depends on the crowd, it flows from the integrity of his being. The curse of the chosen one is also his gift. To be alone is painful, yes, but in that aloneness one may discover the deepest freedom of all. The freedom from needing to be seen, adored, or understood. To walk alone and yet not be broken. To stand as a light, even if no one thanks you for burning. In the end, leadership is not about crowns, applause, or victory. It is about endurance. It is about becoming the kind of person who can carry projection, envy, and freedom without losing oneself. It is about discovering, in the silence of solitude, a strength that no crowd can give. And perhaps that is the true secret of the chosen one. Not that he is elevated above the many, but that he learns to carry what the many cannot. Not that he is blessed, but that he is burdened. And in bearing the burden, he becomes something more than he was. The curse of the chosen one, then, is also the path to transformation. For to be chosen is to be alone. And to be alone is to become, if one endures it, unbreakable.